All right. So hi everyone. This is the third webinar for gender and power, and it's all about your ecosystem. So just some housekeeping as always, please keep yourself on mute when you are not speaking. You can select gallery view on the top right-hand corner to see everyone's faces. Feel free to type questions in the chat, but we'd love it if obviously you participate out loud. And note that this is a webinar, so this will be recorded. So the focus today is all around your ecosystem. So we're going to talk about how you can use your unique position of power to influence positive, inclusive change in your region's entrepreneurial ecosystem. And when we talk about ecosystem, we're really talking about all of those structures, people, and organizations that are involved in supporting the growth of the ventures that you support through your intermediary and your programs. So our objective is really to look at how we can increase access and inclusivity of our ecosystems for all genders or for a specific gender. And as always, we're looking at access to obviously increase the diversity in the pool, but then also inclusivity to make sure that we can benefit from the impact of having a more diverse, whether it's a pool of mentors or entrepreneurs or investors. We need to make sure that their voices are heard and that they're able to contribute to the decision making. So that's what we've got inclusion as well. The outcomes for today are to look at how we can apply gender lens in how you as an intermediary engage with your ecosystem, and also what are some key strategies that you can implement to do so. So the agenda, we're just going to start same format as our other webinars with an introduction. Then we're going to look at the framework that we use for how to identify issues and create strategies. Then we're going to define the key elements that make up an ecosystem, and then more specifically the ones that we're going to discuss today, and look at strategies for 3 of those elements. And then we're just going to have a group discussions around what you are hoping to achieve in relation to your ecosystem. And then we're going to close and discuss next steps. So just as an introduction, again, we're going to look at what are your gender objectives for your ecosystem. So this can be, your objective can be a quota. The example we have here is 50% of women in your mentor pool, or 50% of investments that are directed towards your female founders. The objective around gender when it comes to your ecosystem can be a mandate. So it can be that you want to ensure that all funders take into account the gender of your founders or founding team when they're making an investment. It can be a consideration. So that can be that you will consider the gender in your mentor pool. And then it can be that you have no gender objective when it comes to how you engage with your ecosystem. And it could be that you're just not considering gender at the moment in how you engage with the different stakeholders outside of your organization. Again, the objective for today is all about how to increase access and inclusion to your ecosystem for all genders. And as always, when we look at applying a gender lens, so when we look at how your activities impact or are experienced by different gender groups, we want you to consider intersectionality, which is really how different factors like ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, may compound the effects of advantage or disadvantage that are perpetuated through your activities. So that's just something to take into account. So this is the process and frameworks that we go through at the start of our webinars in how these are structured. So the process of identifying issues, it's really to understand what your objective is around gender for, in this case, your ecosystem. Then looking at identifying specific problems in relation to why that objective is essentially not being able to be met, and gathering information around that. And then looking through the gender lens in how potentially you'd be able to address that issue. And then you look at what strategies you can create and come up with and test in order to solve for that problem. And that again goes back to really understanding your gender objective, and then testing different strategies with your target in a lean way, as lean as possible, and just having that very experimental mindset to see what works within your context specifically. And there's always a few different kinds of strategies, and we've just categorized them in easy and complex. So easy are the ones that are low resource and low time. Complex are higher resource and longer time. And this will really vary depending on your context, where you are, even like your program cycle, how you interact with your ecosystem, what's happening in your ecosystem. So this is why we always mention that contextualization is super important. And as much as we'll suggest some strategies throughout this webinar, it's really all about taking them, experimenting, and making sure you contextualize everything so that you actually gain the benefits of solving issues within your own context and ecosystem. Okay, so now we're going to get started and look at the different elements within your ecosystem. Manita, did you want to go through that one?
Yes, thanks, Audrey. So again, context in this case is really, really important. So the example we've got here is from YGAP's experience working in Australia, across the Pacific, across Africa, and in Bangladesh, and we're about to branch into South Asia. And what we wanted to demonstrate here is that as an accelerator, right in the middle, or an intermediary that we can say, we have a lot of influence and on how we can actually ensure that the entrepreneurs that we support have the best support to generate the social impact that they need. A lot of the ecosystem players are connected to the intermediary directly. And we show this via the arrows, and often the relationship works from the intermediary to the ecosystem player and vice versa. So it's very rarely a single direction. And I think that's really important to remember, because a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about is relational. What we have seen throughout our work is there are these components. So there are within the intermediary, we work directly with the entrepreneur. But in order to survive, both ourselves and in order for our entrepreneurs to survive, we require funding. And so the funders come in the bottom component of that slide. How is the funding distributed, or how do we actually acquire the funding? That's through foundations, so philanthropic funding, through corporate funding, and through investors, which is in the top left-hand corner. And investors can play multiple roles. So they can actually fund the accelerator or the intermediary ourselves. They can also invest directly into the entrepreneur. They can also contribute or co-fund with foundations. So this again depends on where you are in the world. Government plays a really important role, especially in the work we're doing here. So the SFI work, I guess, is all government funded. So they can play a really important role, looking not only at gender, but also the success of intermediaries. And then we look at universities, which we work with here in Australia, but not so much in some of the other countries. And then mentors, media, storytellers. So there's lots of influences around. What you see in the green boxes is what we're going to focus on the most, because through all our research and through our work, we find that the government, mentors, and funders are probably the three most critical players in affecting the work we do as intermediaries. And we also have a big ability to influence how these ecosystem players implement gender. So that's what we're going to cover today. So would love to hear from you, Komal, if you'd like to say that if you have any other ecosystem players that you think is important. But just before that, I just wanted to highlight as well how important context is around all of this. So for example, as an intermediary, what's significant for our work in Bangladesh may not be significant in Fiji. And that's the same with your work. Like what we have working in Pakistan might not be what's actually relevant here in Australia. So the ecosystem is really, really different in all the regions we work in. And we just wanted to highlight that in this particular webinar, that's really important as well. So Komal, we sent a couple of emails around any issues you currently are seeing in your ecosystem. So did you have any feedback on either really broad issues around gender or specific to you as an intermediary, around issues of gender?
Yes, we do sort of, we also act as an intermediary, and we've, I mean, there's an observe, I mean, there's an observe, I mean, we've observed something that, especially in the government sector, they, again, this is just in, saying that mostly in their, functions or events or conferences or seminars, we've observed that there's less representation of women. So again, the women representation, either it's the speakers um, uh, or the invited guests. So recently, when we attended this event, which was of Punjab government of, I mean, it was investment and trade uh, representative of the government. And so they held an event, and it was on a tech conference. And they invited all the guests. And again, we saw that on the panel there were 7 men sitting, and there was no representation of women. So this is a general observance, general observance made. And second thing that I would point out is, I think I mentioned it even last time as well. It was how, because we've been talking to entrepreneurs, we sort of have these one-on-one, what sort of challenges they're facing. So there's this one entrepreneur who works in the tourism sector, and she was talking about how whenever she sort of talk to some local body in, for example, in northern areas of Pakistan, local tourism representative body, so she's not taken seriously. And secondly, what repeatedly we've observed is that talk to our women entrepreneurs as well, that I think this was something that I mentioned last time, that the investors especially, they hesitate while investing in a women-led company, because they think that women are I mean, there is this one person who even said that you should look after the family. I mean, aren't you going to look after your family? So I mean, there are these sort of questions that come up. So yeah, this is the general sort of points that I could think around the ecosystem that we are in, especially the government side. I think we've worked with policy making institutes as well, but somehow, like, the relationship that we have is it's fine, because we mostly are women, again, as I mentioned, in our team, and I mean, we are taken seriously. I think maybe my founder of Social Innovation Lab, she might be able to, I think, maybe explain in detail some what she has faced as along these 4 or 5 years. But this is something that I've even observed in the past year. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. And we are going to talk about government. And I think what you've highlighted is really important to understand when it comes to different ecosystems, which is that cultural and societal norms play such a big part in gender-related issues when we're looking at the ecosystem, and they are really, really difficult to navigate. We are going to talk about a few things, and we just wanted to highlight, like, it's so interesting to hear it directly from you, because it's we've got specific examples from the different countries that we work in, but it just highlights that even in Australia, in a so-called developed country, we face very, very similar things. So it's not unique to emerging markets or so-called other developing countries that we work in. So, and we are going to cover this, but thanks so much for sharing. We'll cover a few of those issues ourselves.
Amazing. We'll have a bit more time at the end as well if we want to discuss further, if we haven't really addressed any of this in the strategies that we mentioned. As Manita said, we have a section on government. But thanks for sharing again, Kamal. Really appreciate it. All right, so as we mentioned, we're going to talk about 3 key elements of the ecosystem, which are mentors, funders, and government. So just when it comes to mentors, we know that they can play a really critical role in supporting the enterprises that we support through our intermediaries, and they can do that beyond the length of our program as well. And they tend to be past entrepreneurs. I have been there before and walked in the shoes of an entrepreneur and can kind of share their knowledge and their expertise with the founders. But depending on where you are in the world and what you define as mentors, some people also include coaches and subject matter experts in there as well. So the key problem when it comes to mentors is really looking at the power dynamics that are involved in that mentor and mentee relationship, especially when there are different genders involved. And so that can be anything from a male mentor and a female mentee, where the male mentor may not be able to fully grasp what the female mentee is going through or the problems that she's trying to solve for her community, and so may not be able to advise her in the most valuable way. But it can work the other way as well. It can be a female mentor and a male mentee, and in my experience in the programs that I've run is that there could be different power dynamics there, and at times it is that the male founder doesn't actually put as much credibility to the female mentor in that case, which can also obviously undervalue the advice that she's providing or her experience that she's sharing. So it's really important to understand where the power lies. And, you know, they can also be, there's just power in the relationship between a mentor and mentee, regardless of gender, because the mentor is perceived as the person with the expertise and the experience as well. And that can, in some cases, be abused as well. So it's very important to have a look at how power dynamics influence all the interactions in that sense. So when we look at mentors, the questions to consider are, what are the cultural and societal norms of having a mentor and mentee relationship between people of different genders? And I would say also of people of the same gender. So if there is something around someone that's has more experience, a bit older, is there somewhere around the power dynamics and the respect that kind of influences the relationship there? What is the individual founder's need with respect to a mentor? How do we attract mentors of different genders? And how can we educate our current mentor pool in applying a gender lens to how they mentor and coach founders? So how can they be aware potentially of their own biases, of their own privilege, so that they can make sure that when they are entering in that mentor-mentee relationship, they can deliver the most value and make sure that that value is received by the mentee. Yeah, so those are the questions. Sorry. So so we're really looking at how can your mentor pool best support all genders. And so the strategies that we can be looking at is to develop an understanding of founder needs and their perceptions of working with different genders. As I just mentioned, depending on the mentor, the gender of the mentor and the gender of the mentee, there will be different power dynamics that can just stem from societal norms. So it can be something that's quite systemic, but to just understand them helps to cater to those relationships and maybe arrange them to make sure that they're the most effective. So for example, can be something like if a founder has experienced trauma relating to or by being in contact with a certain gender, then this might need to be considered, and they might be better off in terms of the value and the transaction being associated and paired with a mentor of the other gender. The other one is to have a gender diverse mentor pool. So this can obviously bring a lot of value, different perspectives, rich knowledge. It can help, as we saw in our previous webinars, in just attracting as well more diverse cohort, because they will have more role models and they'll know that they can get advice from people that see the world in a similar way that they see the world, of a similar gender. And then you can also provide mentor training around how to apply a gender lens and how to be aware of their own biases when they're interacting with their mentees. How can they apply a gender lens themselves and be aware of the perceived power that they hold in that relationship when they do engage with the mentee? And how can we provide them with tools potentially for them to be able to navigate those and have the most successful mentor-mentee relationship? You can also establish a mentor code of conduct and have terms of references. So that again, it's not just for the mentor. I would recommend having mentor code of conduct as well as mentee code of conduct, so they both know how to act and both have a common language to navigate that relationship. And then you can have a mentor-mentee relationship policies as well. So this can just be articulating what is and what is not acceptable in that mentor-mentee relationship to avoid, I guess, issues moving forward. That's what I had around gender. Manita, did you have anything else to add when it comes to mentor and gender?
Sorry, I was just on mute. Of all of those, I think one of the most important ones is actually the mentor training and developing the mentor relationship. We can talk about identifying gender dynamics and input it into our curriculum, input it into our organization and our values. If we then fail to train and provide that information around our values and our approach to the mentors, we have a big break in the system and the big break in the effectiveness of how we support our entrepreneurs. What we have found through our work is that our entrepreneurs rely on our mentors quite significantly. After our program, has the end date, that relationship continues. So there's a strong potential for or everything that we teach around gender and everything that we want to be considered around gender to not continue if the mentors don't retain that. So that's a key thing. And then the mentor relationship and disrupting that power dynamic. So I think those two things are the most critical and where intermediaries can have the most influence, because we are the ones who are connecting the entrepreneurs up to the mentors, and we can create that environment for them. So of all of them, they're the ones we're working on as well.
Great, thanks, Manita.
Yeah, no problem. So the next one we're going to look at is funders, and funders play a very different role in intermediaries depending on your size, where you're located, and how you depend on them. But in general, funders play a very fundamental role in enabling the growth of us as intermediaries, and also for the ventures that they support. When we're looking at funders, we're looking at predominantly three main groups of people, I guess. So we look at investors. Now, these investors can make investments into your intermediary, depending on if it has a commercial model or not. But more than likely, these investors are the ones who are providing investment in some way, shape, or form into the entrepreneurs that you support. So that's one group. The second group are the philanthropic donors. Most of us as intermediaries working in emerging markets are very dependent on philanthropic donors to support our work. These donors will predominantly give us funding to survive, and also to our entrepreneurs if they have that direct relationship. If you're very fortunate and you're an intermediary who can generate your own revenue through selling your products or through self-generated revenue streams, that's brilliant. And in that case, we consider the customers in relation to how the revenue is brought in. We're not considering them in this particular case. What we are really focusing on when we're looking at gender dynamics and our ability to influence as intermediaries is with investors and donors. So one of the big things to understand is that when it comes to donors and investors, as an intermediary, we always talk about our objectives around gender. We also need to understand their objectives around gender and what is their appetite for gender-related issues. It's really important to understand that, because that's how we can have influence with them. So some of the things we want to consider in general in this world today, and something we covered in the workshop in Singapore, is that while we understand as intermediaries that the maximum social impact created is through the entrepreneurs that we support, unfortunately, a lot of the power is still retained with those who hold the money, i.e. the funders. And whether we like it or not, some funders can hold, a lot of unconscious bias and an appetite for wanting to influence how that work is done. As intermediaries, we have the power to disrupt that in a very strategic way. So financial sustainability is really important for both the intermediaries and the enterprises. So we need to be very strategic in how we actually work with these funders. So some of the questions we want to consider when we're looking at funders is, how much influence do your funders have on your operations as an intermediary? So for example, if you are a recipient of philanthropic donations, how much of that funding is tied versus untied? How much do you have to report on that funding? Do you ever chase that funding? We've all, at some point in our life cycle as an organization, have been tempted to say, oh, this funding exists. Let's see if we can do some work to attract that funding. And that's okay to do in that early stage of your organization. It becomes increasingly difficult when you know exactly what you're doing and your goals. And that's when tied and untied funding becomes really important. When we're looking at investors in particular, we want to look at how funders are influencing the pipeline of ventures coming in. So for example, if your investors or the investors that you are connected with have a certain requirement for return on their investments, either financial returns or impact returns or the terms of payment, whether we like it or not, that will naturally impact how we as an intermediary select applicants into our program, which might not completely align with what we're trying to achieve. So in YGAP's case, we focus on social impact number one. If we suddenly get an investor who wants to give us $1 million and says that we will give you $1 million, of which $800,000 we want to support the entrepreneurs that come in, there is, whether we like it or not, there's a natural inclination to go, wow, that is so much money. Let's look at that. But without knowing, that's actually going to impact on who we bring into our program. And we might not bring in entrepreneurs that we know will deliver really deep social impact, but not the return that the investors want. So really important question to continually ask as you're looking at donors and investors is how much influence they are having on you as an organization in the pipeline coming in. Another question to ask is, do your funders or do the funders to your enterprises actually interact with the ventures that they support or that you support? And we're going to come to why this is actually quite important. So when we look at the strategies, we want to look at several different things of how can we actually ensure that our entrepreneurs are supported by our funders to do the best work that we want them to do. So some of the strategies we can look at to disrupt any negative negative power dynamics in relation to gender is looking at how can we remove bias, right? So one way of doing that is to create a really robust criteria and scorecard to determine your investment thesis. And investment can be an investment in the true sense or a philanthropic grant in that sense. But when you have a robust criteria, then any pre-held bias that a donor might have or an investor might have gets pushed to the back in a lot of ways because you're using that criteria to determine which entrepreneur will get that funding. And this is something that we talked about in the previous slide, is it's a really great strategy to ensure inclusivity and ensure that donors are supporting the actual work and not favoring what their bias is to actually invite the funders to help you guys develop this criteria. So have a session where you explain the work and you explain why certain criteria is important. One of the things that YGAP always says is authorship is way more powerful than ownership. So make sure they're invited into the whole process. The other thing is to invite funders to actually meet the ventures on the ground, face to face. This way they get a really deep understanding of the actual ventures and what they're achieving. And it can help remove any preconceived notion that one particular funder or one particular venture is better than another. So what we see in the Australian landscape and some of the other ones we work in as well, is funders and investors, the investment committees and the people controlling the money in this funding organization tend to be men. And naturally, they tend to actually favor ventures that are founded and led by men. They tend not to understand some really critical gender issues of why certain marginalized groups, and in this case, women, are disadvantaged through the work that they don't support, if that makes sense. So if you have the opportunity to invite these funders to actually meet the entrepreneurs that you're supporting, that's when a deep understanding can occur. Another one is, and this is in really focusing on accountability, measurement, and reporting. We always say this, understanding gender and applying a gender lens is very, very complex. The ecosystem around this is very nascent. A really good way to ensure that everything we're saying and everything we're applying has some validity beyond our belief is to be accountable, to measure the impact of it, and then to report against it. And having a really disciplined approach to saying this is actually what we're going to measure against our gender metrics is going to help us. This will take time, but investing in this at the outset will help you develop some arguments as to why funders need to support particular ventures. Why is having female-founded ventures important? How are these female-founded ventures generating a higher level of social impact? Over time, you'll actually be able to measure this and be accountable for this. So the next one we want to talk about is government, and this is probably the most trickiest one. And we all know that government can play such a big role in so many of our countries and regions that we work in, but they can also be the most difficult to navigate. So some of the things to consider is how much does the government influence how you operate as an intermediary? For example, in Australia, no one quite knows what to do with social enterprises and incubators and accelerators at the moment. There's a big hype associated with it. People think it's really exciting, but, and this is a big but, our rules and our regulations don't match up to what is actually conducive to an intermediary being able to operate and social enterprises being able to thrive. There is a big gap in our system at the moment. Now, high level, the government understands the importance of social impact, but the regulations are lagging behind. So at the moment, we would say government doesn't influence how we operate. However, as an intermediary, we are penalized in the same way as other not-for-profits, as well as commercial operations. Now, this will be very different depending on the governments in the countries that you work in. So it's really important to understand how much influence your particular government has on your operations. The second one to consider, and this is, you'd be very fortunate if you have this, because at the moment only Australia and Canada, to our best knowledge, has this, and the government of Denmark, is does your government actually apply a gender lens to their work? Do they apply a gender lens to how they create policy, how they distribute funding, how they relate their communications? We are very fortunate here in Australia that our government, especially the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, have a gender lens across their work now. It is very, very new. And we are working collaboratively with them to implement that and to actually analyze it. So it's very new and it's very fortunate that we have it, but a lot of work needs to be done. And the third thing to consider is who are the key players that can be leveraged to influence and support our work as intermediaries around gender, who we can then use to influence government. This is a really important one. And this is all about how can we have allies around us? often as intermediaries, we work very lean. We have small teams. Even though we're doing big work as such, a great way to influence government is to have allies around you who's shouting the same advocacy related issues that we are. So we're going to talk about this a little bit more. So when we want to consider the strategies, a really good way to contribute toward how the government can implement gender into their policy and their strategy and how they distribute funding, we want to talk about 3 key strategies that we've tried and tested in different ways. One of the first ones, which government actually love, is to actually collect financial return and social impact return data to demonstrate the impact of their work. So we are actually doing this right now with our government here in Australia. We are looking at how the gender policy is related to the work within our government, how it's related to the work that we are doing at the moment, and that information is going to be related back to the government to go, okay, they've allocated this much work, they've applied a gender lens, this is the actual impact of what's happened. That again, there's a time lag, but it's really important to start creating that robust method of monitoring and evaluating and collecting that information, so then you can influence policy change. And that goes into the second one, is to actually using the data to influence policy and funding decisions. This is key and critical to any kind of social impact funding. If you can demonstrate a good return on impact and return on investment, then that's very likely to influence how government is allocating funding. And the last one is similar to the last dot point, is to gain support from other partner organizations and individuals to help influence government. This is a really, really tricky one. So one of the things we do here in Australia, and one of the things we're doing globally, and you can see this through our work on Frontier Incubators, is we work with many partner organizations. We don't have to be doing exactly the same things, but we're all advocating for the same outcomes. And when there's a joint voice across multiple organizations, and when you can demonstrate beneficiaries beyond just your work, that plays a big role in influencing government's policy. One of the things that I'll end with when we're considering government is issues around gender is still very new, and it's not understood in governments around the world. And at the moment, as we said, government of Denmark, Canada and Australia are leading in this space, but even then they're quite new. We as intermediaries can have a really strong influence in how we can not only help them consider gender related issues, but how we can actually influence them into creating policy change and funding distributions to then support our work as intermediaries. But we can't do this alone. And C, which is listed at the bottom of that slide, is probably the most important, is to get a group of people together, other stakeholders, to help shout our concerns and create a really strong advocacy arm.
Amazing. Thank you, Manisha. So now we were going to have a group discussion to just look at what issues you're currently facing in your ecosystem around gender. And I know, Kamal, that you already shared some of the ones you were facing with the government, as well as with the investment and investors potentially not taking women ventures as seriously as other ventures. What strategies you have tried and how did they go, and what strategies are you interested to test in your ecosystem after today? So I guess, Kamal, we'd love to hear from you if any of that content resonated with you, and for the issues that you mentioned earlier in our call, whether you have tried anything so far and how that went, if you did.
Yes, so one thing that was interesting is the government one, in which it's written that using data to influence policy. And this is something that we've tried and we are actually doing it. So we are working with the UNDP to develop a report around impact investment in investing in Pakistan. So right now, I mean, we are sort of ending that report. We've talked to around 20 investors in Pakistan and entrepreneurs. So we sort of combined both the sides, the entrepreneur side and the investor side. So again, so this is something that we will share with the government, and then maybe we are hoping that that would influence the policy somehow, especially around impact investment. So that is something that we already have tried. Yeah, so the other strategies, I think the mentor training one is something that I think we haven't really considered, mentor training around gender and how to have gender lens around that. And again, my question would be around that how do you I mean, mentors don't have time, right? So how do you train them? Do you invite them? Do you send an online? Do you do it online? So yeah. So this would be something that I would like to know.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on, again, your context. So I know that for me, when I ran my last accelerator, we had being part of the mentor group was quite exclusive. So there was a little bit of an onboarding process associated with it. And once they were onboarded, then it would definitely be around their schedule and their availability and how busy they were, and taking all of that into account. But the first steps were for them to just really be across the code of conduct, some training, to make sure that they're the right fit, and vice versa. So that's where we placed our training. And we also did training around, for example, coaching. So how to essentially go into the conversation and not, I guess, say that you have the answers to all the questions. So that actually goes back to the power dynamics, and not say that you're the expert at everything, but how can you approach it in a way that the mentee, the entrepreneurs, has the answers within them, and you're kind of facilitating them coming up with those insights. So that's where we placed that. And that was an offline component that we did, but we also ran it over like a Zoom session if that mentor wasn't able to attend the group kind of mentor networking night that we had, where we did all of this training during. So it really depends on your mentor pool and your context. What I will say is that the feedback from that mentor group that I work with, they really find a lot of value. In Australia, a lot of the mentor groups are volunteers, and they find a lot of value in gaining knowledge that will help them in their day-to-day life and in their own businesses as well. So things like coaching or even knowledge around the gender dynamics and how they can be aware of their own biases to be able to better, work with their own teams in their own businesses, in their own organization, as well as interact in the mentor-mentee relationship. They've really, really enjoyed those kind of sessions, because that's the way that we were, as an intermediary, able to provide them value that wasn't financial or monetary, because we couldn't pay them. So in our context, and this was our mentors in Singapore and in Australia, they really, really valued to be trained in those topics, but that I'm very aware that that's in our context. So it really depends on how you interact with your mentors at the moment, and potentially just asking them, I'm not sure how you communicate with them currently, but asking them whether these would be topics that they would find interested in and what format they would prefer to have them delivered in. And that's what we normally did with surveys and face-to-face when we had networking nights, to just understand our audience a bit better and make sure that we're catering to their needs and also meeting their schedule kind of requirements.
Right.
And I'll just add to that, Kamal, some of our best mentors are the ones that we have really deep relationships with, like as an intermediary. And part of it is when we're having those initial conversations and inviting them to come on board as mentors, we make it really clear about the work we're doing and our focus area. So in relation to gender and applying a gender lens, this is quite new for YGAP as well. But because we have it on all our position descriptions, we talk about it in all our quarterly reports and our weekly newsletters, we're starting to communicate it to all our stakeholders and our mentors that this is a key focus area. So as we bring on new mentors, we are very explicit about our values, and how we want, how our approach is. So for example, we've gone from saying it's YGAP's impact to actually this isn't our impact, this is the impact of our entrepreneurs. We've shifted from saying from pitch events to saying these are showcase events for all our entrepreneurs. Those slight changes, not only are we making, but we're being very deliberate in talking to our mentors about, so they understand how we want to behave with our entrepreneurs as well. And that we kind of break that sort of power dynamic straight away, because a lot of our mentors continue to be or have been very successful entrepreneurs, and they just want to give back. Some of our best mentors never talk about themselves, right? They will facilitate what Audrey was saying, facilitate the question and answer and bring out the strengths of the entrepreneurs. We use how they operate to talk about the kinds of mentor relationships we want from new mentors. So rather than saying, this is YGAP's way and this is what we think, we're like, we've got these great mentors and this is what we found that works really, really well. And have that really, really clear in our conversations. And also have that really clear when someone signs up to a mentor-mentee relationship. So when they're signing up to it, we'll have a document that actually articulates what's expected of them, what's expected of the mentee. So it's really, really clear. And then we just see how it goes. But we actually have all of those conversations at the outset. So it's meeting our values and also meeting what we believe that the entrepreneurs need.
Right. Thank you.
No problem.
Another one thing I think maybe we would test in the future was, that was an interesting point, to measure against the gender metrics. And so this was around, like, if you measure it and then you have to be accountable, you have to show it to the funders, right? The data and everything. So that was, so that is something that another strategy that we might be interested in to test.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can share with you broadly what we're doing as part of Frontier Incubators, the metrics. And it's really interesting because they're quite broad metrics. And then what we're doing within YGAP as well, in relation to outputs and outcomes, what we're starting to measure now, and what we hope to be able to evaluate in 3 to 5 years down the track. So it's all very trial and error at the moment, but we're being simple but very specific to help us answer. Like, for example, one of the questions we want to answer is, do female founders generate more social impact than their male counterparts? Right? That's what we're trying to see. And then when we invest in female founded ventures, do they generate more impact than their male counterparts? Now, whatever that answer is, it doesn't actually matter, but right now, because we don't know, but it's actually going to help inform whether we need programs like Why Her and things like that in the future. So we're doing this right now, and we can share what we're doing. And as for the more broader metrics, we can talk to you about what we're doing across Frontier Incubators. It's still in the process of being developed, and also what we're applying with our entrepreneurs and within our programs as well.
Great, thanks.
Amazing. Did you have any other questions, Kamal? Or
no, I think I'm done.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for your contribution again.
Thank you, you guys.
No worries. So we're just gonna wrap up this webinar. So the key takeaways, again, is to look at what is your gender objective in relation to how you as an intermediary engage with your ecosystem and the influence that you want to have. And, even questioning whether it is a gender objective at all. So that can be, as we mentioned in the beginning, a quota mandated consideration, or it can be none at all. Again, applying a gender lens is all about seeing through the eyes of different genders and taking into account those different factors like race, age, that can compound the effects that and the experience of those different genders. And then when it comes to strategies, you can have easy, quick strategies and longer term ones, and that all depends on your context, where you're at, the resources that are available to you, your focus, your objectives, and all these different factors. So again, one size does not fit all. And as we can see, there were specific strategies that kind of spoke to you in terms of things that would fit well, you think, within your context. And again, it's not that all of them will fit with where you're at and make sense to apply at this point. In terms of next steps, so we've got, again, one-on-ones, and I know, Kamal, that we have R1 schedules, but if you want to schedule one-on-ones to flesh out the strategies that we've discussed in any of the webinars, you can contact us directly via Slack or email. You have 4 one-on-ones that I included as part of the FI program. And next on the Gender and Power calendar, we've got our second seminar on the 8th of May, and that will again be a facilitated group discussion around everything we've discussed so far, so program organization and now ecosystems, and all the issues and strategies very much to then put it within your context and have you as a cohort of intermediaries to support each other in a discussion around what you can do within your own context and environment to make equitable change. So that's really the end of this webinar. Thank you so much, Kamal, for joining. And yeah, so we'll see you in a couple of weeks for our second seminar.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.